My father didn't skip my wedding by accident. He chose not to come. No call. No message. Just an empty chair where he should have been. Years later, when my hotel company hit $480 million and my name made headlines, my phone buzzed. It was him. And that single text changed how I saw everything we'd never said. My name is Avery Caldwell. And the ceremony was already in motion when I noticed the chair in the second row, aisle side, still perfectly empty. The one with my father's name printed neatly on the card. White cardstock, gold lettering. Untouched. At first I told myself he was late. Traffic. Parking. A last-minute delay. My mind offered excuses the way it always had, quietly, instinctively, before I could stop it. I kept my smile steady as the music swelled and the guests rose to their feet. I walked forward anyway. But as I reached the altar, the seat remained empty. No movement. No hurried whisper from an usher. No phone vibrating in my bouquet. Just absence, clean, deliberate, undeniable. I felt it more than I saw it, like a missing note in a song everyone else seemed determined to enjoy. I didn't cry. Not then. I had learned long ago that crying in public only made people uncomfortable. Instead, I focused on my breathing. On my partner's hand tightening around mine. On the promise, I was about to make one that did not require my father's approval to be real. Still, I caught the looks. The quick glances from relatives who knew exactly which seat was supposed to be filled. The soft, sympathetic smiles that tried not to linger. Someone coughed. Someone else adjusted their camera angle to avoid the gap. My father didn't call that morning. He didn't text. He didn't send a message afterward saying he was sorry, or even explaining why he couldn't come. He simply didn't show up. As we were pronounced married, and the room erupted in applause, I realized something quietly devastating. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't bad timing. It was a choice. And standing there, smiling for photos beside an empty chair, I made one too. That was the last time I waited for my father to show up. My father was never cruel in obvious ways. He didn't yell or disappear entirely. What he mastered instead was distance measured, polite, and perfectly deniable. To anyone looking in from the outside, he was a respectable man, reliable, practical. The kind of father people described as well-meaning. To me, he was a man who believed love should be earned. Growing up, his approval came with conditions. Good grades were expected, not celebrated. Achievements were only valuable if they fit within his narrow definition of success. Stability mattered more than happiness. Predictability mattered more than passion. He respected careers that came with titles people recognized and quietly dismissed the rest. When I talked about my ideas starting something of my own, building instead of inheriting, he listened with a polite smile that never reached his eyes. He warned me about risk. About embarrassment. About what people would say if I failed. Failure, in his mind, wasn't a lesson. It was a stain. Every conversation seemed to end the same way. Be realistic, he'd say. As if realism and ambition couldn't exist in the same breath. When I pushed back, when I chose paths he didn't understand, his support cooled. Calls became shorter. Advice turned into silence. Silence into absence. He showed up when things looked presentable. Graduations, formal dinners, moments that photographed well. But when I needed encouragement, when I needed someone to believe before there was proof, he retreated. I learned not to ask. I learned to succeed quietly. By the time I got engaged, I had already lowered my expectations. Still, a part of me hoped stubbornly, foolishly, that my wedding would be different. That on that day, at least, he would choose me over his doubts. But the empty seat told me what years of restraint had already taught me. My father wasn't someone I could rely on to stand beside me. He was someone who watched from a distance, waiting to see if I was worth claiming. The days after the wedding passed in a soft blur of thank you notes, leftover cake, and quiet mornings that felt heavier than I expected. Friends asked how I was adjusting to married life. Relatives sent messages about how beautiful everything had been. No one mentioned the empty seat, but everyone had seen it. I waited. Not desperately, just enough to notice the absence. I checked my phone more often than I wanted to admit. A call explaining he'd been sick. A text saying he'd made a mistake. Even a short message pretending nothing had happened. Any acknowledgement would have cracked the silence. None came. A week passed. Then two. Then the silence settled into something solid, something intentional. My father didn't reach out to ask how the wedding went. He didn't congratulate us. He didn't even offer a polite excuse. It was as if the day had never existed. For the first time, I didn't chase him. I didn't send a message asking why. I didn't try to smooth things over or explain how much his absence had hurt. I had spent too many years translating myself into versions he found acceptable. This time, I chose not to perform. What surprised me most wasn't the quiet, it was the relief hidden inside it. Without his judgment hovering nearby, there was space to breathe. Space to begin my marriage without carrying an old ache into something new. Eventually, holidays came and went. Birthdays passed without acknowledgement. The distance grew, not with drama, but with neglect. And in that neglect, I found clarity. Silence, I realized, can be just as loud as rejection. It tells you exactly where you stand. And after my wedding, my father made his position unmistakably clear. So I stopped waiting. I stopped hoping for words that were never coming. The absence that followed my wedding didn't break me. It freed me. For a long time, I believed closure was something another person gave you. An explanation. An apology. A moment where everything was finally said out loud and neatly resolved. I thought if my father ever reached out, if he ever admitted what his absence had meant, I would feel lighter. But as weeks turned into months, I began to understand something harder. Closure wasn't coming. Not because I hadn't earned it, but because he wasn't capable of giving it. My father had spent his life avoiding discomfort, especially when it required accountability. Waiting for him to change would mean staying tethered to the same disappointment, just dressed in new hope. So I stopped waiting. I didn't announce it. I didn't confront him or demand answers. I simply redirected my energy away from a door that had never truly been open. It felt unnatural at first, like walking away from a conversation that hadn't officially ended. But there was power in choosing myself without permission. My marriage helped me see it more clearly. I had chosen a partner who showed up not only when it was easy, but when it mattered. Someone who didn't need proof of my worth before offering support. That contrast was impossible to ignore. Letting go of my father emotionally didn't mean erasing him from my past. It meant releasing the version of him I kept hoping he would become. The one who would finally step forward and say, "I see you." That version existed only in my imagination. There was grief in that realization. Quiet, private grief. But there was also peace. I learned that some relationships don't end with confrontation or closure. They end when you stop investing in unanswered questions. Walking away without closure wasn't weakness. It was the first decision I made that didn't require his approval, and it changed everything. When I finally stopped looking backward, all that energy had to go somewhere. I poured it into work not as an escape, but as a place where effort still meant something, where results spoke louder than explanations, where no one asked me to justify why I believed in myself. The first hotel wasn't impressive. It was a tired, mid-sized property on the edge of a growing city, overlooked by flashier developments and written off by investors who preferred safer bets. I saw something different. Not luxury, not prestige potential. I put nearly everything I had into that first acquisition, knowing that if it failed, there would be no safety net waiting for me. The early years were relentless. I learned every corner of the business because I couldn't afford not to. I negotiated contracts by day and reviewed maintenance reports by night. I spent weekends walking hallways, listening to staff, fixing problems before they turned into headlines. There were months when expansion felt impossible and nights when I questioned every decision that had brought me there. I didn't talk about it at family gatherings when there were any. I didn't post milestones online or announce acquisitions. Success felt fragile in its early stages, and I protected it by keeping it quiet. I had learned what happened when people decided whether you were worth supporting based on appearances. One property became 2. Then 4. Each one carefully chosen, deliberately paced. I reinvested instead of celebrating. I passed on deals that promised fast recognition but compromised long-term stability. The company grew not through spectacle, but through consistency. Years passed before I realized I had built something substantial. A small portfolio had turned into a network. Local teams became regional leaders. Quiet meetings turned into boardrooms where my voice carried weight not because of who my father was but because of what I had proven. By then, the chain had expanded across multiple markets, with partners who trusted my judgment and staff who believed in the vision. The numbers grew steadily, almost cautiously, as if respecting the silence that had protected them. What no one in my family knew, what I never bothered to explain, was that every brick, every contract, every risk, had been placed by someone who no longer needed permission to succeed. I wasn't building to be seen. I was building to last. For a long time, my success lived quietly with me. It existed in spreadsheets, late-night calls, and the steady rhythm of growth that didn't need witnesses. I had grown comfortable with that. Privacy had become a form of safety. Then one morning, it stopped being private. A business publication reached out first, asking for comment on a pending acquisition. I declined, as I usually did. A week later, another outlet called, then another. The same numbers kept coming up in conversations I hadn't started: valuation estimates, expansion maps, projections that no longer belonged only to me. When the headline finally broke, it was impossible to ignore. My company's name was there in bold letters, followed by a number that felt surreal even to me: $480 million. The article laid out the story: our growth, our strategy, our footprint across multiple cities, as if it had always been visible. As if it hadn't been built quietly, deliberately, in rooms where no one was watching. Friends began texting congratulations. Former colleagues resurfaced, eager to reconnect. People who had never asked what I was working on suddenly spoke as if they'd always known. I read the article once. Then I closed my laptop. What surprised me wasn't pride. It was calm. The number didn't change who I was or what the work meant. It didn't feel like revenge or vindication. It felt like confirmation, proof that the years of silence, discipline, and restraint had added up to something real. The attention kept coming, but I stayed grounded in the same routines. Meetings still needed to be run. Staff still needed leadership. Growth still required caution. What had changed wasn't my life, it was my visibility. For the first time, my success existed outside my control. It reached people I hadn't invited into the story. And somewhere beyond the congratulatory messages and public praise, I knew one person in particular would see it too. The man who hadn't come to my wedding. The message came in the evening, long after the initial wave of headlines had settled. My phone buzzed once on the kitchen counter while I was making tea, the sound ordinary enough that I almost ignored it. Then I saw the name on the screen. My father. For a moment, I just stared at it. The last time he had contacted me was before the wedding. Months of silence, untouched, now broken by a single notification. I didn't open it right away. I let the screen go dark and finished what I was doing, as if that small act of delay could help me think clearly. When I finally read the message, it was exactly what I expected and still disappointing. I saw the news. Congratulations. I always knew you'd do well. That was it. No mention of the wedding. No acknowledgement of the absence. No apology. Just a neat sentence that tried to fold my success into a story where he had never doubted me. I read it again, slower this time. The words felt careful, almost strategic. Pride without responsibility, affection without accountability. It was a message designed to reconnect without reopening anything uncomfortable. I felt the old reflex rise in me, the urge to explain, to respond graciously, to make room for him. Years of habit don't disappear overnight. But this time, something was different. The timing said everything. He hadn't reached out when I married. He hadn't reached out when I struggled. He hadn't reached out when my success was invisible. He reached out when it was public. I set my phone down without replying. Not out of anger, but out of clarity. Some words arrive too late to mean what they pretend to say. And his had arrived long after I stopped waiting. I didn't intend to respond, but a few days later, I did. Not to reopen the past, and not to seek an apology I no longer needed. I replied because silence, this time, felt like avoidance rather than choice. We spoke on the phone. No raised voices. No accusations. Just two people separated by years of unspoken history, finally acknowledging each other's presence. He sounded careful, proud, even. He told me he had always believed I would succeed, that he worried about me in his own way, that he thought giving me space had been the right thing. Each sentence smoothed the edges of the past, reshaping it into something easier to live with. I let him finish. Then I spoke, calmly and without emotion. I told him the facts, that he hadn't come to my wedding, that he hadn't called afterward. That silence wasn't guidance, it was absence. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't list every hurt. I didn't need to. There was a pause on the line, longer than before. He said he hadn't realized how much it had affected me. I didn't argue with that either. Impact doesn't require intent to be real. I told him I wasn't angry. I told him I had built a good life, one that didn't depend on his approval. But I also made something clear. I wasn't interested in rewriting the past to make the present more comfortable. If we were going to have a relationship, it would be based on honesty, not selective memory. No pretending. No claiming credit after the fact. He didn't push back. He didn't apologize either. And strangely, that was enough. The confrontation didn't end with reconciliation or rejection. It ended with boundaries quiet, firm, and finally mine to set. For a long time, I thought success would heal the oldest wound I carried. I believed that if I built something undeniable, the absence I felt would finally make sense, that the people who doubted me would see me clearly at last. But success doesn't repair what silence breaks. What changed my life wasn't the valuation of my company or the headlines attached to my name. It was the moment I stopped measuring my worth through someone else's approval. Walking away from unanswered questions gave me more peace than any apology ever could. If you're reading this and waiting for someone to finally show up, your parent, your partner, your family, let me say this gently. Your life doesn't begin when they acknowledge you. It begins when you stop pausing it for them. Grow quietly if you have to. Build without applause. Protect the parts of yourself that don't need an audience to be real. And when recognition comes, because it often does, decide carefully what you allow back into your life. I didn't lose my father when he skipped my wedding. I lost the illusion that he would ever be the person I needed him to be. Letting go of that illusion gave me something far more valuable than closure. It gave me freedom. If this story resonated with you, please subscribe to the channel and stay connected. Like the video, share your thoughts, and tell us where you're watching from. Stories like this are stronger when we talk together, because healing, clarity, and strength grow through shared experience.